I'm a historian of social movements. I'm going to say that in the preface what I'm going to talk about. My first book was on gender and political protest in the radical peace movement from the 1940s to 1970s. And then I slightly shifted gears to write a historical biography of a Catholic nun. And I'll explain a little bit about how that actually makes sense. So I am writing a biography of this woman named Evita Ford, who was a Maryknoll sister. And she did foreign mission work in the 1970s in Chile from 73 to 79, and then in El Salvador in 1980. And she became known in her death, not in her life, but in her death, because she was one of 4 North American churchwomen who were killed by the National Guard in Salvador in December 1980. So this is the work that I'm working on. That's not what this book is. Although I'll talk a little bit about my research in this book. This book is an edited volume, and it grew out of a panel about 5 years ago at the Organization of American Historians on religious networks and social radicalism. And in this panel there were 4 papers and an excellent commenter, and we examined the entwined histories of religious faith and leftist social and political activisms. And it was a great panel. It was really like the papers were compelling, like we got rave reviews. People came up to me like the whole weekend telling me how fabulous this panel was. So we decided that we had the foundation for a book, an edited volume in our hands. And I'd clearly never done an edited volume before, because if anyone's ever done it, then the result is like, what were we thinking? It was a total distraction from my research, and there was like years of herding cats and like contributors who fell off the face of the earth and never responded and whatever. But we ended up with this book, which I actually think is a pretty good book, and I'm pretty happy with it. The goals of this book, it's called The Religious Left in Modern America, Doorkeepers of a Radical Faith, was to fill a gap in both the historical literature as well as, to some degree, in contemporary understanding of the relationship between religious faith and left politics in the 20th century U.S. The notion that there's a religious left, it seems to most people kind of alien to our understanding of contemporary America. So a lot of work on faith and politics in kind of post-war era, especially post-1980, really looks at the impact of faith on the politics of the right. And so there's, everyone thinks of religious politics, they think of the religious right. And there is a lot of work on the intersection between religion and radicalism in 19th century American history. People write about the abolitionists, the temperance movement, prison reform movement, women's rights, but that sense that there was a connection between faith and progressive politics seems to disappear from the scholarship once we get close to the 20th century. And in part it's because there's this expectation that the United States has become this secular nation in the 20th century, and that somehow religion doesn't really fit in on that. So this goal of this volume is to kind of fill a gap and kind of belie this notion that religion and leftist politics doesn't belong in our understanding of 20th century American history. In the volume, we take the idea of religious faith seriously, and faith is the key word here. This is not about religious institutions and religious organizations. This is about what people believed and how that motivated them to take actions and how that sustained their work. So I think it's important, and this is, as someone who grew up in a very secular mindset, like working on this has been a challenge, because I have to think about spiritual beliefs as more than, I used to joke that the Bible was like a fairy tale. And I need to think about, in this case, these spiritual beliefs were not just flights of fancy, irrational imaginings, but they were as real to the people who performed them as this book or this table. Like, they were very concrete things. So we're trying to make that part of it visible as well. So what the volume does, there's 13 essays in the volume, and it presents what we think of as an all too missing history of this religious left tradition. We start in the late 1800s with farmer labor struggles and the social gospel. We move into things like YMCA internationalism in the 1920s, Catholic anarchism in the 1930s, Jewish involvement in communist and labor struggles, also 1920s, 30s, 40s, moving us up into the present day, and complicating also, not just adding things, but complicating the way that we think about the place of faith in social movements that we're aware of. So, for example, when we think of religion and progressive social movements in the post-war era, people generally think of civil rights struggle and Martin Luther King and this idea of the beloved community. And so we have several essays in here that really complicate that. There's one essay that looks at black theologians from the U.S. and kind of their internationalism and their connection to people involved in anti-colonial struggles after World War II, and how those anti-colonial struggles then shaped the theology that they developed in the United States. There's also a really excellent piece on spirituality and the Black Power movement, which is one place where this idea of religion is like almost completely absent. There's stuff on female theologians, Hispanic struggles for social justice. So it's a pretty varied group of essays. The intent was not to give like a start to finish story. They're really a bunch of kind of case studies and stories, just to give us a view of what could be there. Well, if you read it in its entirety, there are a few conclusions that we were able to draw. One is that despite all the differences, there is also a lot of heterogeneity in terms of gender, sex, class, theology. Themes of transformation, moral politics, personal courage, and fortitude, those are themes that come up in all of these traditions. And what we were able to see was that whatever their vantage point, religious radicals were able to look at American society and conclude that it needed to be reordered in order to create what they thought of as a kingdom of God on earth, and that faith really served as a source of personal and collective courage and motivation. So I want to talk a little bit about my chapter in here, which is part of my larger book that this project was a total distraction from, but to give a more concrete description of how this played out. So I'm writing this biography of Evita Ford, who, as I said, was one of the 4 churchwomen killed in El Salvador in 1980. She was born in 1940 in Brooklyn and was very much a young woman of her generation, very cosmopolitan, educated, lived in New York City. Her niece remembers her as her hip aunt who lived in Greenwich Village in the 60s and wore go-go boots. So totally not, you know, your stereotypical image of a nun. She became a Maryknoll sister twice, once in the early 60s, and had to leave for medical reasons, and then returned in 1970, kind of going against the tide when like women were leaving religious orders in droves, and she actually went back in. She served in Chile in the 1970s. She arrived there in 1973, right before the military coup that installed the regime of Augusto Pinochet, and she lived in a shanty town in Santiago, Chile, during that time. And during that time, she was engaged in pastoral work that looked a whole lot like grassroots community organizing in the United States. And that was one thing that I thought was pretty significant. I'll come back to that. She was in Chile until '79, and then in 1980, the Archbishop of El Salvador, Oscar Romero, was needing reinforcements because the church was under siege by the government and the military, and he sent an invitation to the Maryknoll Sisters, because they were very well trained in foreign mission, if they could please send some people to help him in El Salvador. So Ida and her companion sister Carla went to El Salvador at Romero's invitation, and they arrived just as he was assassinated by death squad. So that was the beginning of their time there. She arrived in March 1980, and even though they had lived under a military regime in Chile and had seen things that were very terrible, they were completely unprepared for the violence that they saw in Salvador. Throughout her time there, she was there for 8 months, and then finally in December 1980 was abducted and murdered by the National Guard. So I'm using her experiences as a Catholic foreign missioner in the 70s and 1980 to explore how religion and politics overlapped and merged in mid-20th century left and progressive social justice efforts. So I really see this as an extension of my work on social movements. And in particular, what I'm trying to do is give women religious a central place in the history of the global 60s as a bridge between nonviolent social movements in the US and Latin America. At the same time, I'm grappling with how Ida's religious beliefs and her sister's religious beliefs, their faith, not only shaped them, but the world around them. And really trying to see how what religious studies scholar Robert Orsi calls the civic and the sacred, how those came together in their lives. So the first piece is just thinking of them as part of the global 60s. And as I said, Ida was born in 1940. She came of age with the generation who kind of created the New Left. And their search for authenticity was mirrored very much in her search for authenticity, which she found in spiritual practice that then became very connected to struggles for social change. The Maryknoll Sisters, there's a picture I have on my office door of Maryknoll Sisters in Selma, Alabama in 1965 at the front lines of struggle. Some of the sisters that Ida went in with, they studied with Saul Alinsky in the 1960s. These were women who were very much attuned to the social movements of their time and had practiced in those social movements. And then I think of them as bringing that, when they went overseas, they brought cultural baggage with them, and part of their cultural baggage was their experience in social movements. So that when I looked at what they were doing, particularly what Ida was doing in Chile in the 1970s, it did look a lot like kind of grassroots community organizing that you would have seen in Mississippi in the 1960s in terms of emphasizing participatory democracy, having kind of indigenous leadership, and so they would use their social and political capital to encourage local people to take on leadership roles, and then they would step back. So it looked a lot like that kind of work, and so seeing them as part of kind of that global 60s and really linking nonviolent social movements in the US with nonviolent social movements in Latin America, and in their case through the form of liberation theology and this very radical small d democracy. So in one sense, I can see them as kind of political actors. But I want to emphasize, and this is part of what this work and this volume are about, that even though her work had political implications, and those political implications were really obvious in her death, the fact that she and her companion sister were on a death squad list, they were targeted by the military. It would be a mistake, I believe, to label Ida and the women she worked with as quote-unquote political in the most common sense of the term that we use. And in fact, the Maryknoll Sisters at the time of Ida's murder and still today refused to characterize their work as political. Above all else, Ida and these people, they saw their work as a response to their faith, that it was what motivated them to take the actions that they did. I see their efforts to resist injustice and violence as a part of a faith-based effort to resist what people call the principalities and the powers of domination and oppression, what Ida called evils worse than death. It wasn't that they didn't understand that their work had political implications. I don't want to cast them as like naive, godly do-gooders. They totally understood what they were doing, what they were getting into. When Ida lived in Chile, she worked with the Comité de Paz, which was the Catholic Church's response to the human rights abuses of the Pinochet regime, and was actually one of the few institutional forces that kind of organized against that. She knew what she was doing, and when she was in El Salvador, she was really clear and even said to people that, like, she understood that they needed to take sides, that if you didn't take sides, that you couldn't not take sides, and so they had to take a side with the poor, which put them, they understood, in a political space. At the same time, during her time, especially in El Salvador, the things that she's talking about with people and the pieces of her that I have left behind are all about her faith. So she and her companion sister, one of the things they did in Salvador was bring food and medicine to refugees who had fled to the mountains when the military came to raid their villages. And as they drove along in this Jeep, you know, they would sing songs Ida loved to sing. And they weren't singing the Internationale, they weren't singing political songs, they were singing a song they wrote that was all about their love of God. And I actually have a lovely recording of it, so like I can hear them doing this. This is like a totally non-political song about like the Lord of the Road who was going to carry them here and take them there and grant them peace. This very, very religious thing. After Ida was murdered and the Maryknoll Sisters went to her room in this parsonage in Chalatenango province to gather up her very few belongings that she had, and over her bed she had this poster. And again, it was not a political poster, but it was a prayer that was meant to give her sustenance as she dealt with what was kind of very real fear during her time there. So beyond my chapter on Ida, I think of her and the essays in the volume. They really show that over the course of the long 20th century, faith served as a touchstone for followers of the religious left tradition. In good times, it was an inspiration of kind of a moral compass to keep them on a spiritual path. In darker times, it was kind of a life raft, something that kept them going, a source of hope that despite difficult circumstances, their work would ultimately usher in a better day, which I actually find something really important to think about in these times, which also feel particularly dark. For them, faith in a transcendent power greater than humankind and belief in the scriptures that this power inspired, it could push them to engage in activities and take risks that most rational people would shun. And I really think, again, of Ida being in Salvador, that, again, she saw the kind of violence that most people would see and run screaming from quite rationally. And she could have, as a North American, bought a plane ticket and gotten out of there and gone home. And she didn't. She stayed, and part of that, you know, doing things, she did things, and other political activists, these religious left activists, would do things that really went beyond the imagination of their secular counterparts and really challenged some prevailing paradigms of protest. And I would argue it also allowed these members of the religious left to embrace an alternative definition of effectiveness, which, again, something that, if you think of in rational terms, means certain things, but really moving beyond the logic of secular rationality to promote new ways of thinking and acting, which then influenced the more secular movements of their time.
Great. Thanks a lot.